Good morning. Today we are going to read a psychological exploration of how art works by Ellen Winner. And I'm going to start on chapter 2 because chapter 1 was just a really short, almost more like a preface than, the text itself. So, chapter 2. Can this be art? Art is one of the most complicated of human endeavors. This claim will become apparent to anyone who tries to define what art is and what art is not. To a visitor from another planet, and who tries to defend this definition from one counterexample after the next. Attempts to define art have a vexed philosophical history. These definitional attempts have focused primarily on the visual arts, hence the arguments and examples in this chapter are primarily visual. British aesthetician Clive Bell remarked, "Everyone in his heart believes that there is a real distinction between works of art and all other objects. Invariably, however, carefully crafted definitions leave out many things we want to call art, just as they typically include many things we don't want to call art. Yet all, or most of us, think we know art when we see it." Sarah Goldschmied and Eleanor Cherry's installation, Where Shall We Go Dancing Tonight, consisted of empty champagne bottles, cigarette butts, and confetti spread around the floor of a room in the Museum Bolzano in northern Italy. The museum's website discussed this piece as an exhibition about consumerism and hedonism in Italy in the 1980s. But when the cleaning staff was asked to clean up the room after the book party had been held there, they not surprisingly mistook the installation for after-party trash, and they dumped it into the recycling bins. When this blunder was discovered, the museum retrieved the trash from the bins and reconstructed the work. So what happened to the Goldschmied-Chari installation what happened to the Goldschmied-Chari installation is a clear-cut case of somebody implicitly classifying a work displayed in a museum as not art. It is similar to the case of the French conceptual artist Marcel Duchamp's porcelain urinal, a ready-made found object that he had titled Fountain and submitted to the Society of Independent Artists in 1917 exhibit. The submission was rejected, but today museums and art historians treat his ready-mades as art. Duchamp's original work was lost, but Duchamp made a replica, which was auctioned off at Sotheby's in 1999 for $1,762,500. His snow shovel that he titled En Prévision de Bruce Cassé, in evidence of the broken arm, hangs in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, as does the third version of his bicycle wheel, mounted on a painted wooden stool shown in figure 2.1. The original from 1913 was lost. Duchamp believed that any extraordinary object could be elevated to the status of an artwork just by an artist choosing that object. The artwork is thus not an actual object, but the idea behind it. Duchamp wanted to move art away from something to look at, he called retinal art, to art that makes us think, and to the question, what is that art? But to the uninitiated, like the cleaning staff in the Italian Museum, these objects provoked a negative reaction. Why would anyone think these are art? And then it shows in the figure 2.1 Marcel Duchamp, the bicycle wheel, the third version. Pretty cool. Just the spokes, you know what I mean? Just the spokes. One can ask the same question about avant-garde composer John Cage's work 433, which requires the performers to remain completely silent on the stage for the amount of time given in the title, so that the audience members can listen to naturally occurring sounds and consider these as music. Why would anyone think of silence on stage and coughs and creaking chairs and raindrops heard in the concert hall as music? We not only feel entitled to declare something presented as art as not art, we also willingly and freely denounce certain works of art as no good. Recall the 19th century salon critics rejecting works by Impressionists, or the near riot that ensued in 1913 when Ivor Stravinsky's ballet, The Rite of Spring, was performed. However, claiming that something is not art is not the same as claiming that something is bad art. I consider how we evaluate the good and the bad in art in Chapter 8, but for now, are there any rules on which we can agree that tell us whether or not a pile of bottles in the corner of museum gallery is or is not a work of art? Philosophers define art. Centuries of thinkers have tried to define art in terms of one or more necessary and sufficient features. I offer you here a brief and incomplete laundry list of definitions offered by philosophers, and one Russian novelist, Plato, in The Republic, made representation, or mimesis, that's a new word for me, the defining feature of art. He believed that all works of art were imitations of ordinary objects, and therefore inferior to them, just as ordinary physical objects were inferior to the ideal non-physical forms of these objects. Immanuel Kant defined art as a kind of representation that had no external purpose, that exists only for itself, though it has the power to communicate and stimulate our minds. Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy defined art in terms of its function, to express emotion. And Clive Bell defined a work of art as something that has a significant form, non-representational combinations of lines, colors, shapes that led to an aesthetic emotion, because only significant form can provoke an aesthetic emotion, an emotion different from all other kinds of human emotions, one that transports us out of the ordinary human concerns into an exalted state. That one's deep. George Dickey proposed the institutional definition of art. A work of art is an artifact that has been offered up as a candidate for appreciation by the art world. Monroe Beardsley offered the functional definition. A work of art is something that affords or is intended to afford an aesthetic experience. That is, it causes us to consider the aesthetic value of the object. Gerald Levinson proposed an international historical definition. A work of art is anything intended to be understood like previous artworks were understood. The problem with some of these definitions is that they are non-inclusive. Defining art as a form of representation leaves out non-representational forms of art, such as most music and abstract art, just as it includes representations of what we would not call art, such as diagrams or mathematical equations. Defining art as something that expresses emotion leaves out art that is not highly expressive, conceptual art, decorative art, minimalist art. Defining art as something presented to the art world as Defining art as something presented to the art world as art leaves out outsider art, never shown in a museum. These theories are circular. If something is art because it provokes an aesthetic experience, according to Beardsley, or an aesthetic emotion, according to Bell, or an aesthetic experience or aesthetic emotion is what is provoked by art. We have circular, non-testable proposition. Some theories confuse or conflate the distinction art / or not art with the distinction good art / bad art. For example, paintings that Clive Bell dislikes are said to lack significant form and thus not art. Sir Luke Fildes, most likely, or something like that, painting The Doctor, which hangs at the Tate Museum in London, was deemed not a work of art by Bell because he found it sentimental and descriptive and unable to provoke aesthetic ecstasy. Bell did not realize that not everyone is moved by the same works of art. And he dealt with this problem by saying that I have no right to consider anything a work of art to which I cannot react emotionally. Thus, apparently, a work of art can have significant form for you, but not for me, and thus it is art for you, but not art for me. In 2009, Dennis Dutton, a philosopher of aesthetics in New Zealand, published a scholarly but also highly entertaining book called The Art Instinct: Beauty, Pleasure, and Human Evolution, in which he analyzed our needs for the arts by invoking state arguments from evolution, considering this need as an instinct. In my view, one of the most important contributions to take on the problem of defining art. So in her view, one of the most important contributions was to take on the problem of defining art. Okay. He argued that we should not begin by pondering how to include atypical cases in the category of art, cases such as a museum gallery floor strewn with bottles and confetti. Instead, he insisted we should begin with indisputable cases of art so that we can understand the center of art and its values. He offers us not a set of necessary and sufficient features meant to apply to all works of art, but instead an extensive list of features that he believes characterize typical works of art. Here are characteristics, but not necessarily features, of prototypical works of art processes according to Dutton. Skill and virtuously, novelty and creativity, representation, expressive individuality, emotional saturation, direct pleasure, intellectual challenge, imaginative experience, culture of criticism, style, special focus, existing within art traditions and institutions. Although none of these are meant to be necessary features, that does not mean that anything goes, because even if there is no one way to be a work of art, it does not follow the converse many ways are so hopelessly numerous as to be unspecifiable. I think it's useful to divide Dutton's features into three broad categories: what we perceive in works of art, how we respond to works of art, and contextual aspects of works of art. In the second section, I'll explain what he means by each one. See what you think. I'm sure you will think, for counterexamples, art that does not possess a particular feature, underscoring that this feature need not be present for something to still be considered art. So, what we perceive in a work of art, per Dutton. Skill and virtuosity. Got it. An art object is made with skill. This connects to pleasure. We admire skill and recognize great skill as deeply pleasurable. Necessary? Duchamp's ready-made did not require technical skill because they were found, not made. Nor did Cage's 433. Exclusive to art? No, just think of sporting events, chess matches, and great speeches. All of these take skill. Indeed, Dutton never argues that any one of his features are either necessary or sufficient. Novelty and creativity. An art object is novel and if an art object is novel and original, it also connects to pleasure. We like to be surprised. We admire novelty and recognize it as pleasurable, necessary. What about art in school of a great master? Not so novel. Novelty is always not exclusive to art. Just think about the taxi driver who finds a creative way around traffic, or the scientist who makes a new discovery. Representation. Much art involves representation, and harking back to the first criterion listed, Dutton notes that we take pleasure in representation for the skill behind it, and because we may find the depicted objects pleasing in themselves. Necessary? not for music and abstract art, and not exclusive to art, since maps, equations, and codes are also representational. Expressive individuality. Artworks express something about the artist who made them, and we enjoy thinking about the mind behind the behind the works. Necessary. Perhaps in my view, when in the presence of a work of art, we cannot help but wonder about the mind and personality of the maker. But certainly individual expression is not exclusive to art, for this can be found also this can also be said of any activity that is not totally rule governed and that allows for creativity, whether cooking, hairstyling, or advertising. And a bunch of other things, I'm sure, too. Emotional saturation. Artworks are emotional. As an experience, they perceive as is the experience of perceiving these works. The representational content of the work provokes emotions in us, such as sorrow at a sad scene in a painting, and the tone or expression of the work that is also perceived and felt. Necessary? No. Minimalist paintings are not saturated with feelings. The emotion was not exclusive to art because funerals and weddings and many of other life's experiences are saturated with emotion. So how do we respond to a work of art? Per Dutton. Direct pleasure. Art causes immediate pleasure for its own sake, with no utilitarian value. Necessary? No. A work that does not please us at all is still art, even if we do not like it. And the pleasure is not exclusive to art, since lots of things give us pleasure for their own sake. Game of tennis, a sunrise, ice cream, or sex. Intellectual challenge. Artworks challenge us intellectually, and this too is pleasurable. Excuse me. The philosopher Alva Noé, I think, excuse me, echoes this view. Sorry about that. Okay, so Alva Noé echoes this view when he writes that art aims to disclose us to ourselves and expose to us what we did not know about ourselves. He calls art a strange tool because, unlike most artifacts, art is a tool that has no ordinary utilitarian function. Because it has no practical function, Noé writes, art forces us to ask, what is the thing that I see in front of me? If we ask this to extend our minds and have experiences we would not otherwise have, if we ask this, we extend our minds to have experiences we would not otherwise have. Necessary? Not for those artworks who are hackneyed, not for a pop romance novel, but likely necessary for art we classify as great. Is this characteristic exclusive to art? Perhaps not, because many non-art activities also challenge us when we try to make sense of them, like listening to a lecture on string theory or working out a mathematical puzzle. And yet, those do not expose us to ourselves. Perhaps immersing ourselves in art is more like going to a psychiatrist. Both experiences challenge us and force us to introspect. Imaginative experience. Artworks create an imaginative experience for both the maker and the perceiver. And Dutton thinks this is maybe the most important of his 12 features, and so do I. Okay, artworks are experienced in a pretend world. We know that fictional characters are not real, yet they make us frightened, sad, relieved, and happy. We listen to music and experience emotions, even though no events are causing us to feel sorrow, joy, and excitement. These imaginative experiences caused by art are decoupled from any practical concern. In Immanuel Kant's 18th century words, art is for disinterested contemplation. Dutton offers an example of a football game, asking why this is not a work of art, even though it gives pleasure, elicits emotion, requires skill, and is associated with criticism, and is given special focus. But not art. But it's not art because watching the game is not an imaginative experience. This is not the virtual reality of art. It is actual reality. And we care who wins, and we do. We care who wins. A similar point was made by the Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset. Okay, the artistic object is artistic only to the extent that it is not real. In order to enjoy Titan's equestrial portrait of Charles V, it is a necessary condition that we do not see the authentic living Charles V, but only a portrait of him. That is, an unreal image. The man portrayed and his portrait are two completely distinct objects. Whether we are interested in the one or the other, in the former case, we associate with Charles V. In the latter, we contemplate the artistic object as such. In my view, imaginative experience may well be a necessary feature of a work of art. All forms of art, whether visual, music, literature, or dance, invite us to enter into an imaginary space, taking us away from the non-art reality. This cannot be sufficient feature. Other domains also invite us to enter into an imaginary world, like games and pretend play, and perhaps mathematics, although some mathematicians may disagree. Criticism. A critical language accompanies artworks. Critics talk about art, as do audiences. Necessary? If no critic ever wrote about a work of art, would we still call it art? We would still call it art, wouldn't we? Exclusive to art? No. For any human activity that is complex and is accompanied by criticism, whether science, politics, or athletics, we have critical discourse about diving competitions where form is important and somewhat subjective to judge, but not much about speed swimming, where all that counts is the fastest time. Contextual aspects of art per Dutton. Style. Artworks are made in particular styles, and hence abide to at least loosely by a set of rules. Just like most human activities, language use, norms of politeness, nonverbal communication, cooking. Researcher Shigeru Watanabe showed that even mice and pigeons can distinguish paintings by style, discriminating Monets from Picassos, Kandinsky's from Mondrian's. Infants and young children can do this as well. We also group together different artists' workings in the same style. Computers, too, have been trained to classify by styles, distinguishing Impressionism, Surrealism, and Abstract Expressionism at a 91% accuracy. Special focus. Artworks are typically set apart from ordinary life, whether by a stage, a frame, a concert hall, or a museum. This sounds like what the philosopher Schopenhauer meant when he wrote that art plucks the object of its contemplation from the stream of the world's course and holds it isolated before it. This is what another theorist of art, Ellen Dissanayake, meant when she said that art is set apart, made special. A curator at the major museum once mentioned how artists toss around their works in their studios, but as soon as they are brought to a museum, the curators treat these special works with exquisite care and sacrosanct. No, dyslexic. Don't mind me. When artworks are not formally set apart and thus made special, we sometimes do not recognize their value. An assuming illustration of this happened when the acclaimed violinist Joshua Bell agreed to participate in an experiment. After a recent sellout of crowds at the Boston Symphony Hall, he sat in the Washington, D.C. subway in the morning with a hat laid out to collect coins as he played Bach. Most passerbys barely noticed him and gave no indication of recognizing that they were in the presence of an accomplished artist. Art traditions and institutions. Artworks exist within historical tradition, as do all organized social activities of humans. But of course, this is not true of outsider art by prisoners, mental patients, children, and animals. So, how to evaluate Dutton's approach? It is difficult to disagree with anything on this list when it comes to prototypical works of art. But how far does this get us in pinning art down? Can we use this list as a tool to test whether something is or is not a work of art? If not, if none of these features are necessary, as Dutton thinks, and not even if some of these features are necessary, and that is because none of these features are jointly sufficient to make something a work of art. Every one of these features can be found outside of art. Dutton tells us that if all of his features are present, we know we are looking at a prototypical work of art. But he also says that all not need be present. Dutton's list, as he would readily admit, tells us what we need to know about prototypical art, but not art on the fringes. In some cases, Dutton confuses the non-art art distinction with the good art, bad art distinction. That is because some of his features apply only to great art. Novelty and expressive individuality are not necessary only for great art. Lesser works of art are often deviate, but they are still art. Think of works by someone in the school of Leonardo, where the artist strives to paint like in Leonardo's style rather than develop their own individual style. Intellectual challenge is a feature of the experience of great works. But what about the romance novels we buy at the airport? Maybe those are not great, but if they are non-instances of literature, which is a kind of art, then what are they? So, why is art so hard to pin down? Is defining art a more difficult task than defining other kinds of things? Yes, because it is not a natural kind. Natural kinds can be defined by a set of necessary and sufficient features. Water is a natural kind, and we can readily define it as a certain combination of hydrogen and oxygen. Anything with this combination is water, and anything lacking this combination is not water. The makeup of water does not change over historical periods or across cultures. Water is the real thing that the water is the real thing that is mind independent. It exists whether or not humans are aware of it, and the same goes for gold or elephants. And we can verify objectively whether or not something is water, gold, or an elephant. Art is something very different. Art is socially constructed concept created by culture. And because it is socially constructed, it is not mind independent. It is our minds that pull together into one category of things we call art. Moreover, art is a socially constructed concept with very blurry boundaries, unlike the clear boundaries of money, another socially constructed concept. And what counts as art can change over time and over culture. We can liken the concept of art to the concept of game, another kind of mind-independent category. Here is what the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein said about games. I'm great with these names, by the way. I'm just it's a treat. You're welcome. There are many kinds of games: chess, bridge, solitaire, board games, Olympic races, ring around the rosy, pretend play, and there is no one feature or set of features shared by all games. Instead, games are connected to one another by family resemblances. One game resembles another in some features, like eye color in families, but no one feature runs throughout all games or all members of the family. Some games are physical, some cerebral, and some are serious, some are fun. Some are competitive, some not, and so on. There is no best example of a game. Wittgenstein used the metaphor of a rope made up of twisted fibers, with no one fiber running through the whole length of the rope. nor is there any way to verify whether something is a game. If people consider something a game, say trying to beat the traffic light or trying to not to step on a sidewalk crack, or eating bugs on the game TV show Fear Factor, then it is a game for them. Though others might disagree. The concept of a game like art is functional, defined by its use. Such concepts are open ones. Things we never dreamed of as games may become games for the next generation because new kinds of games with different kinds of properties can be invented. The philosopher Morris Weitz argues that art is also an open concept. Its boundaries are defined, are infinitely expandable because it encompasses previously undreamed of forms. We cannot list the defining features of art because this would close the concept. That is the why. Replacing what is art with when is art. To ask whether the Goldschmied Chiari installation, Where Shall We Go Dancing Tonight, is a work of art is to ask a question that cannot be empirically answered. For how could we ever put the question to an objective test? That installation is art if we treat it as art. Whether or not we like it or deemed it good is an entirely different question. The philosopher Nelson Goodman, also the founder of the Harvard Project Zero, the research group where a long time ago I began my investigations into the psychology of arts, argued that we should replace the question, what is art, with the question, when is art? The same object can function as a work of art or not, depending on how the object is viewed. When an object functions as art, it exhibits certain symptoms of the aesthetic. For example, an object functioning as art is relatively full, meaning that more than its physical properties are part of its meaning and should be attended to than when the same object is not functioning as a work of art. Goodman asks us to consider a zigzag line, such as the one shown in Figure 2.2. Told that the line is a stock market graph where we all attend to the number of peaks and dips. We could get the same information from a set of numbers, but if the same line is part of a drawing, say the outline of a mountain, all of the line's physical properties are suddenly important, and part of what an artist wants us to attend to is its color, its texture, edges, thickness, among other things. And we cannot translate this experience into a set of numbers. I take Goodman's concept of repletedness to be a psychological claim about the attitude we shift into when we recognize something as a work of art. This is the claim that psychologists could actually test. The importance of repletedness reminds me of Bell's significant form. When something is functioning as a work of art, we do not only look through it to what it represents. We do not only look through it to what it represents. We also attend to its formal surface properties. Ortega y Gasset, makes the same point as Goodman. When we look at a painting of a garden, we may see right through it the surface properties of the paint and focus on the garden. But what if we do this? We are not adopting an aesthetic attitude. But what if we do this? We are not adopting an aesthetic attitude. Okay. He makes an analogy to looking at the garden through a window. We can focus our eyes on the garden, or we can take the effort to refocus our eyes on the window pane. Then the garden disappears from our eyes, and all we see of it are some confused masses of color which seem to adhere to the glass. Thus, to see the garden, we must see the window pane. Are two incompatible operations. The one excludes the other, and they each require a different focus. This refocusing requires the capacity to reflect on the character rather than the content, the visual experience. And this focusing on the nature of our visual experience may well be at the heart of an aesthetic experience. The philosopher Roger Scruton makes a similar psychological point in his description of the carpenter who chooses the frame of a door. The description of a carpenter who chooses the way to frame a door just on the basis of what looks right. This is purely aesthetic judgment. It is not an instrumental one. And Scruton defines such an attitude as a desire to go on hearing, looking at, or in some other ways having experience of X, where there is no reason for this desire in terms of any other desire or appetite that the experience of X may fulfill, and whether the desire arises out of and is accompanied by the thought of X. That did not make it simple, Scruton, at all. We care about the way things look when we set the table for our guests, when we arrange our living room furniture, when we pick our clothes. These aesthetics of everyday life, Scruton argues, is a state of mind that is fundamental part of human nature and lacking in other animals. Birds may sing, but there is nothing in their behavior that allows us to say that the birds are contemplating how the song sounds. Thus, works of art are things that function in certain ways. They are objects to be enjoyed in their appearance, and whose appearance is to be interpreted purely for what it is meant and without reference to some further practical function. This seems to me to be close to the idea of repleteness. I can't speak. Repleteness. Okay, sorry. Also, that's got to be a key word because I keep having to say it. And also, close to Kant's belief that the aesthetic attitude is one of disinterested pleasure, divorced from practical constraints, and divorced from any desire for the object causing the pleasure. Consider the second Goodman symptom of the aesthetic, metaphorical exemplification, which I prefer to refer to with the more transparent term, expression. When an object is functioning as a work of art, it has a particular property of evoking without representing. It can express properties that it does not literally possess, such as a mood. A painting can express sadness or joy, but is not literally happy or sad. A painting can express loudness, but is not literally loud. A symphony can express color, but is not literally colorful. One would not describe a scientific graph as expressing emotion or loudness or sharpness. So the same zigzag line can express properties it does not literally possess when a perceiver attends to the visual properties and thus treats it as a work of art in Goodman's functional sense, as opposed to its informational content, and thus treats it as a graph. Of course, we can still respond to the scientific graph in terms of how ugly or beautiful it is, but we do not impute non-literal properties to graphs. Dutch cognitive psychologist Rolf Zwaan carried out a study in 1991 that I believe provides a direct support for Goodman's claim that the same object can function as art or non-art. He presents people with 6 texts, some of which were originally from newspapers, other from works of literature. Both could pass as either news stories or literature. Half of the people were told that they were reading an excerpt from a newspaper account of events. The other half were told that they were reading an excerpt from literature. The hypothesis was that the text read as literature would be read more slowly because literature is to be savored rather than skimmed. As the linguist Roman Jacobson noted, in literature, the poetic function of language is primary. We focus on the structure of the message rather than looking through the message to its meaning. It follows then that how the meanings are conveyed. The precise wording should be recalled better in text. Wait. I checked out. Where am I? It follows then that how the meanings are conveyed, the precise wording, should be recalled better in a text read as literature rather than as news. Following is one of the texts used in the study, originally a news article about the former Romanian political prisoner. His first confrontation with the police dates from winter 1983. He studied to be a stage director at night school and worked in a studio during the daytime. The energy shortage, a consequence of megalomaniac investments in the petrochemical industry, was dire. Two measures became simultaneously operative. The energy price was multiplied, and then the supply of energy was severely reduced. The propaganda campaign accompanied the Cold War under the slogan 50% materials, 100% performance. Soren drew a man cut in two, wrote the slogan underneath it, and sneaked at night into the factory gate. He pinned up the drawing, believed himself unseen. The next day, he was picked up from his work. At first, he was treated in a friendly manner at the police station. He was offered some coffee. During the interrogation, the central question was by whose order Soren had pinned up the drawing. Soren remained silent. They hit him. He refused to talk. They threatened to cut his wrists. He denied having anything to do with the drawing, and then they showed him the door. Just go. As he walked down the corridor, the officer grabbed hold of him and knocked him unconscious. When he came round, he lay in the corner of the cell, his hands and face covered in blood. 2 fingers of his right hand were paralyzed. They had cut the tendons. He was then allowed to go. In the bus, people wondered about his blood-covered face and hands. When people believed that they were reading literature, they read more slowly. Consistent with the finding, verbatim memory for the surface features of this text was higher when people thought that they were reading literature. This was measured by presenting people with sentences from the text with one word in capital letters. Some of the time, the word was a synonym for the original word read. The task was to decide whether this was the word used in the text or not. In Goodman's terms, the text became replete when it was approached as literature. In contrast, when the participants thought that they were reading a news account, they looked through the words and their meanings and hence confused synonyms with what they had originally read. For Goodman, it makes no sense to ask if the text was literature. We can only ask whether it was functioning as literature, and the same goes for any kind of art. Goodman's approach differs from Dutton's in his insistence that what makes something art is how it's perceived. A pattern made from accidental spilled paint can function as a work of art if I attended to its repleteness and its expression. The Goldschmidt-Chiari installation was functioning as a work of art to viewers who attended to the patterns created by the way the bottles were laid out, whether they were carefully laid out or just tossed there, and who noticed that this work expressed corruption and decadence. But this same installation was not functioning as a work of art for the cleaning staff, who presumably noticed none of these things. But in another way, Goodman's approach was similar to Dutton's. Both give us a probabilistic way to determine whether something is a work of art or if it's functioning as one. Like Dutton, Goodman believes his symptoms are neither necessary nor sufficient. But if all or most are present, the object is likely functioning as a work of art. Thus, neither White's, Goodman, nor Dutton give us a set of rules against which we can definitively test an object's art/non-art status. So replacing what is art with what do people think is art? What do people think is art? Okay, that's the new question. Philosophers worry about what is art, or what art is. Psychologists do not. Instead, we want to find out, they want to find out what people think art is. These are quite different questions. The philosopher's question presumes the right answer if we can think clearly enough. A philosopher's methods entail reflection as well as thought experiments. For example, testing an imagined example of art against a proposed theory to see if it is encompassed by that theory. The philosopher's right answer could be a logical definition, as Bell offered a probabilistic definition, as per Dutton and Goodman, or an acceptance that there is no definition because art is an ever-open concept, as per Weiss, or Witz. I don't know. In principle, philosophers could come up with a definition they propose as true that would differ from the answers that ordinary people would give. That would not trouble the philosopher and would likely have no influence on the ordinary person. Both questions have merit, but they require very different ways of going about answering them, one by reasoning and introspection, and one by empirical study. Some philosophers have become interested enough in psychologist questions to engage in what has come to be called experimental philosophy. Take philosophical issues and study how ordinary people think about them. Richard Camber is a philosopher who carried out a psychological study on the question of what non-philosophers, art professionals as well as ordinary people, think is and is not art. He believes that this kind of study can actually illuminate a philosophical problem, how to define art. Other philosophers might disagree. Nonetheless, what as psychologist and Camber what to find out about is what the category art looks like in the mind of the non-philosopher, or the category of art looks like in the mind of a non-philosopher. Camber used the simplest method available to psychologists, the self-report study. He posted 2 online questionnaires designed to test people's intuition about whether various objects qualified as art. So unlike Dutton, he used only potentially controversial, non-prototypical cases of art, with the goal of discovering where people draw the line. He gave people examples of things that we might or might not classify as art, and for each, participants had to say whether it was art or not art, or whether they were unsure. 151 participants, most of whom were university or college faculty members, completed the surveys. Of the respondents, 52% were art professionals, which included artists, art historians, employees of art organizations, and philosophers of art. 39% were art buffs, people who had taken 3 or more courses in the history, theory, and philosophy of any of the fine or performing arts, and had visited museums at least twice a year, or as well as had attended concerts or plays or at least twice a year. And 9% were neither of these and were considered ordinary folk. Each example Camber presented to his participants was selected to test a particular hypothesis, to see whether people would be willing to allow bad art to be art. He offered a painting of Elvis Presley on velvet. The majority answer was yes, art. To see whether plain old ordinary objects could be art, he gave them white envelopes. The majority was no, not art. To see whether art is something that had to be human-made, he showed them a painting of an elephant, by an elephant, given a brush and to hold in its trunk. The answer was no, not art. To see whether nature qualifies, he proposed a dead tree. Again, not art. Camber's informal survey tells us that educated people who know a lot about art, the majority of his participants, were able to agree on average on where they draw the line between art and not art. And yet, even when most people agreed that an object was not art, responses were never ununanimous. Take an example of the dead tree. 84% said that the dead tree was not art, and 16% said that it was art. Over half of those who said it was a work of art were art professionals. Camber imagines a group of biologists asked to decide whether a plastic Christmas tree is a plant. Not one would say yes. Unlike the boundaries of the biological category plant, the boundaries of the socially constructed category art are porous. And that is why people disagree. Camber designed his study very informally, testing a grab bag of theories, using only one or two examples to test each one. Psychologists Psychologists are more likely to design a study to zero in on one or two criteria that might be used to distinguish art from non-art. One such study was carried out by cognitive psychologist Jean-Luc Jucker. I don't even know if that's how we say that. Jucker. And his colleagues. The potential criterion he addressed was perceived intentionality. Are people more likely to judge something as art if they believe that it was intentionally crafted rather than being the product of an accident? Jucker and his colleagues presented non-art experts with images and asked them to decide, using a 7-point scale, how strongly they considered these images to be works of art. This is a more sensitive measure than yes or no or all or nothing responses that Camber asked of his participants, because it can tell us about degrees of artness. The clever manipulation was the participants saw the images accompanied by artist statements, either making it clear that the image was intentionally crafted to look the way it did, or making it clear that the image was the byproduct of some other action and thus was accidental. For example, the out-of-focus photograph shown in Figure 2.3 was presented in a high intentional condition, accompanied by an artist statement that the defocusing was an attempt to make the colors more vibrant. In the low intentional condition, the same images was presented along with the artist's statement that he had forgotten to focus his camera. There was also a control condition in which the images were presented with no statements at all. Here's another pair of artist statements that stress either intentionality or accident. Accompanying a wooden board with a large trail of black paint, participants read one of the following two artist statements. Number one, because of its simplicity and expressivity, this piece may look like a branch painted in Japanese style. In fact, it is just a wood board on which I had laid a chain that I needed to paint black from another work. And number two, this piece is inspired by Japanese art, which I like for its simplicity and expressivity. And this instance, I have tried to represent a single branch using just black paint, which I applied on a wooden board using a chain. If you responded like the participants, you would have given greater artness rating for the image that you believe was created intentionally rather than to the byproduct of some other action. In a control condition, there was no artist statements accompanying the image. Artness ratings were as high as those for the image accompanied with high intentionality statements. Thus, people assumed that these images were intentionally produced and thus art. Jucker's study shows us that the concept of intentionality is central to art. Works of art are things that are made intentionally. Yet recall from Chambers, participants did not ununanimously classify the dead tree as not art, even though dead tree is not anything anyone intentionally made. Again, this shows us how the boundary between art and non-art is slippery and is not the same for everyone. This is the fate of socially constructed concept. In contrast, a natural, kind concept. Description in the next section. Forced choice studies like Chambers and rating scales like Jucker's lack ecological validity. In daily life, we do not ask ourselves whether a dead tree is art, nor do we ask ourselves the degree in which an object is a work of art. That is why Nathaniel Rabb, manager of my Arts and Mind Lab, and I sought out less explicit ways to get at how adults and children mentally represent the concept of art. Linguistic judgments. Instead of asking what is and is not thought to be art, we explored the kind of concept people implicitly believe art to be. We did this by asking people to judge how sensible various sentences about art and other kinds of concepts sounded, drawing on the work of a psychologist, Barbara Malt, in her investigation on intuitive differences in how we think about different kinds of concepts. The concepts she investigated were nominal kinds, like the triangle, the definition, a triangle, true by definition and defined by necessary and sufficient features, and natural kinds, like animal, which reflects the structure of the natural world and some necessary features, and artifacts, things made by humans and defined by their use, lacking necessary and sufficient features. So each sentence presented to participants began with the linguistic hedge and modifier that qualifies the statement in some kind of way, as shown next. So try this out on a scale from, losing my pen cap, just kidding. Okay, so try this out on a scale from not all sensible to very sensible. How would you judge each of these three sentences? Okay, here it is. Loosely speaking, that's art. According to experts, that's art. By definition, that's art. Now, try this for a natural kind category, animal. Loosely speaking, that's an animal. According to experts, that's an animal. By definition, that's an animal. So, and now try for the nominal kind of category, triangle. Loosely speaking, that's a triangle. According to experts, that's a triangle. By definition, that's a triangle. And finally, an artifact concept tool. Loosely speaking, that's a tool. According to experts, that's a tool. By definition, that's a tool. Our question was whether people treat the concept of art more like artifacts concepts, since artworks are artifacts, than like natural or nominal kinds. So here's what our respondents told us. It sounds better to say loosely speaking and according to experts, and the worse to say by definition. When classifying something as art than when calling something a tool, an animal, or a triangle. So even though art is a kind of artifact like a tool, people do not treat art and tools the same way. Loosely speaking is better for art because art has such loose boundaries, and according to experts is also better for art since when something has loose boundaries, it might need to appeal to experts. These findings tell us something about the kind of concept that art is, namely in comparison to other kinds of categories, including non-art artifacts, or my damn dog barking too much. Just kidding. Art concepts have the loosest boundaries and are delimited by experts to the greatest degree and are the least definable. Okay, so what things do children call art? In a second kind of implicit task, we explore whether children show us, by their namings, whether they distinguish art from non-art. Our question was whether young children have formed an implicit category, art. Children certainly emerge in art activities in preschool and kindergarten, and teachers certainly use the term art around young children. It's time to make art. Has allowed children to form an art category. Has this allowed for children to form an art category? We've shown children around ages 3 to 8 photographs of art and non-art artifacts. Explained that they were made deliberately and with care, and then we ask, what is this? The non-art artifacts include familiar human-made functional objects like a ball, a book, a cup, a toothbrush. For example, While looking at a picture with a handmade toothbrush, children were told, "Lucas has some wood and plastic. He carefully sawed the wood and cut the plastic with some tools. He then glued them together, and this is what it looked like. What is it?" The art artifacts were abstract paintings and drawings. So while looking at one of these, children were told, Nora took some different colored paints and 3 jars of water, and she mixed the paints with the water and then carefully applied the mixture to the page with a brush. Here is how it looked at the end. What is it? Some of the abstract images looked a little like something in the world. Others resembled nothing. We expect children to name and represent content whenever they could. Shown, i.e. or e.g., shown a picture that looks like a sun and ask, what is it? And a perfectly reasonable response is to call it a sun. And so we were particularly interested in what they would say about the purely abstract images. Children had no trouble naming the handmade toothbrush and other non-art artifacts correctly, as did the adult comparison group. And when it came to naming the artworks, even the oldest children rarely used the terms art, painting, or drawing. Instead, when they could imagine something representational in the image, they named the represented objects. It is a sun. It's an onion with lines coming out of it. When they could not see anything representational in the image, they often named the material. It's paper and pencil. It's lines, inks, and splatter of paint. Or described the shapes. It's blue and pink spots. In the following study, using the same images, we asked the children, why do you think he or she made it? After each item, they gave the correct utilitarian explanations for the non-art artifacts like a toothbrush to brush his teeth, and very different kinds of reasons for the artworks. About half of the time, children were able to come up with reasonable non-utilitarian reasons for why someone would make what we presented as an artwork, saying things like, for it to look pretty, and he felt like drawing, to look at it, or to put it on the wall. The fact that children were reluctant to name a painting art or a painting, but had no trouble naming a toothbrush, shows that they are not yet acquainted with an explicit category of art. But the fact that they gave utilitarian reasons for why some would make a non-art artifact are non-utilitarian reasons for why someone would make a art artifact, showing that they recognize implicitly a distinction between these two kinds of artifact. And moreover, many of the reasons they gave for making a picture listed earlier are perfectly sensible. Artists do make images just because they feel like it, or because they want to display them, or because they want to make them look beautiful. These children are actually right on the mark. And so, while we may not be able to agree with whether certain boundary cases count as art, as Chambers showed, we do agree on intentionality as a criterion for distinguishing art from non-art. And as Jean-Luc Jucker showed, and we make an explicit distinction between art and non-art artifacts, as shown in our study of linguistic hedges. And even young children have an implicit distinction between art and non-art artifacts, as shown by the non-utilitarian reasons they offered us for why someone would make a picture as opposed to a toothbrush. So in sum, artworks as a socially constructed category. The definition of art proposed by great philosophical minds have themselves all been disputed by other great philosophical minds. That makes art impossible to define conclusively. It is that artists are always widening the boundaries. Artists intentionally set out to confuse us about our definition of art, to make us question our definition, and to make us expand our definition. In contrast, as my philosopher friend Naomi Sheeman said, Elephants do not intentionally set out to mess with our concept of the species elephant. In addition, as Alva Noe says, art makes us think about ourselves, and art makes us think about art. What it is and what it's doing to us and how it's doing this to us. Artists like to come up with new ways to do these things to us. Dutton's analysis shows that the characteristics that are present in prototypical cases of art, and I think most of us would not dispute these typical characteristics. But when it comes to non-prototypical instances of what some might call art, Camber's survey study shows that even art experts cannot agree on where to draw the line between art and non-art. And yet the human mind cannot help but see similarly across all of the so very different kinds of things that we can all agree are art. A symphony, a painting, a sculpture, a dance, a play, a cathedral, a film. Perhaps we are implicitly using the characteristics described by Dutton to the group of these things under one all-purpose term, art. Now, Goodman's analysis shows us how adopting what I would call an aesthetic attitude can make anything function as a work of art. Splatters of paint or bottles on the ground becomes a work of art, irrespective of whether we call it good or bad art. We can decide to construe them as such. Most important, the philosophical claim, construal changes, okay. How we respond to something, like paint splatters. We start to attend to the surface properties, Goodman's repletedness, and we start to wonder and theorize. What is the artist trying to make me think? Ortega y Gasset made the same kind of philosophical claim about visual art. When looking at a painting as art, we refocus away from what is represented and focus instead on the quality of our visual experiences. Zwann's experiment presenting text as literature versus news articles provided empirical evidence that Goodman and Gasset are right. Constructing a text as literature, art, slows us down as we read, so we can attend to and remember the surface properties of language, then look right through the words to what they mean. And so while neither philosophers nor lay people can define art in an airtight fashion, psychologists, following along the lines of Zwann's study, may well be able to demonstrate the psychological effects of adopting an aesthetic attitude. So whatever art is, we know that it is tightly bound up with feeling. The next section of this book, which I will call Art and Emotion, takes up the question of how it is that we can perceive human emotions in art, and how it is that art can make us feel so strongly. The problem is particularly puzzling for non-representational art, such as music and complete abstract art, with no depictions of humans showing emotions or no depictions of emotion-arousing situations. Can pure form show emotion? Can pure form evoke emotion? And if so, how does this work?